Lady Eleanor Ashworth stood in the library of Ashworth Hall, with her father's ledgers spread across the mahogany desk like evidence at a trial, and she calculated with cold precision exactly how many weeks remained before the creditors would seize everything: the house, the lands, the portraits of ancestors who had managed their estates with considerably more competence than her father had demonstrated over the past 5 years of increasingly reckless gambling. 6 weeks. Perhaps 8 if she could negotiate extensions, but no amount of negotiation would change the fundamental mathematics of ruin. The solution her father proposed was as old as debt itself. Marry wealth, transfer the problem to a husband with resources sufficient to absorb the financial catastrophe. The Duke of Greystone had indicated willingness to consider such an arrangement, motivated not by romantic interest in Eleanor, whom he'd never met, but by his own practical need for a wife who could provide the heir his title required, and prevent his dissolute nephew from inheriting estates the young man would destroy within months. It was, her father had explained with false cheer, beneficial for everyone involved. The Duke would gain a well-bred wife, Eleanor would become a duchess with social position and financial security, and the Ashworth estate would be saved from the auctioneer's hammer. Eleanor had agreed because refusing meant watching her family lose everything, and because at 24, with no other prospects, and a profound cynicism about love after past experience with men who performed affection to achieve strategic objectives, a practical arrangement felt safer than risking genuine attachment that would inevitably end in disappointment. At least with the Duke of Greystone, she told herself. The arrangement would be honest from the beginning. No false declarations, no performed romance, simply a straightforward transaction where both parties understood exactly what they were trading. She would provide heirs and household management, he would provide security and position, and they would maintain polite distance in all matters beyond practical requirements. The sound of a carriage on the gravel drive interrupted her calculations. Eleanor moved to the window expecting to see the Duke arriving for their first formal meeting, but the carriage that stopped before Ashworth Hall's entrance was modest rather than ducal. And the man who emerged was clearly a servant rather than an aristocrat, his clothing practical and his bearing suggesting someone accustomed to taking orders rather than giving them. 20 minutes later, the butler summoned Eleanor to her father's study, where she found him standing beside a man of perhaps 32, who possessed the kind of unremarkable appearance that allowed servants to move through aristocratic households without drawing particular notice. Average height, brown hair, pleasant features, clothing deliberately chosen to avoid standing out. "Ah, Eleanor," her father said with false heartiness. "This is James Carter, who has been sent by the Duke of Greystone to serve as assistant to our steward during the period before the wedding. His Grace thought it would be useful to have someone familiar with his household's accounting methods help organize our estate records so that the transition of management will proceed smoothly once the marriage is finalized." Eleanor studied James Carter with careful attention, noticing several details that seemed inconsistent with a servant's typical presentation. His posture was too confident, his hands too well maintained, his speech when he greeted her carrying an educated precision that suggested significantly more schooling than most men in his position would have received. But perhaps, she told herself, the Duke of Greystone employed unusually qualified staff. "Mr. Carter," she acknowledged with polite coolness, "I hope you'll find our accounting systems reasonably organized despite the estate's current financial challenges. I've been working to establish clearer documentation of all obligations and assets." "I appreciate your efforts, my lady," Carter replied, his eyes fixing on her with unusual intensity. "Clear documentation will make the transition significantly easier. I look forward to working with your steward and with yourself if you're willing to provide guidance about household operations that may not be fully captured in the formal records." "Of course," Eleanor said, because refusing would have been both rude and strategically foolish when she needed the Duke's representative to report favorably about the estate's management. Over the following days, Eleanor found herself increasingly aware of James Carter's presence in ways that unsettled her carefully maintained emotional distance. He was everywhere, in the estate office reviewing ledgers, in the library consulting reference materials, in the servants' hall discussing household operations. and whenever their paths crossed, he would pause to exchange conversations that revealed surprising depth of knowledge about subjects ranging from estate management to literature to political developments currently consuming Parliament's attention. It was perhaps 5 days after Carter's arrival that Eleanor's curiosity finally overcame her habitual caution. She had been in the library when Carter entered carrying ledgers, and their eyes met with awkward recognition that came from two people continually encountering each other in spaces meant to be private rather than social. "My apologies, my lady," Carter said, moving to leave. "I didn't realize you were using the library." "Don't be ridiculous," Eleanor replied, gesturing toward the table. "The library is meant to be used, Mr. Carter. Please proceed with whatever work brought you here." They worked in companionable silence for perhaps 10 minutes before Carter made a small sound of frustration. "May I ask you a question, my lady? I'm encountering some inconsistencies in the household accounts that I'm hoping you can clarify." Eleanor moved to examine the ledger he indicated, and as she leaned over to see the entries, Carter began explaining the discrepancy with remarkable precision. But it wasn't his accounting knowledge that caught her attention. It was the way he quoted a passage from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations with perfect accuracy, his voice taking on the cadence of someone who had studied political economy at university level, rather than picking up practical knowledge through service. She straightened and studied him carefully. "That's quite an impressive command of economic theory for a steward's assistant, Mr. Carter. Where did you study? Your education seems rather more extensive than one typically encounters in your position." Carter's expression showed brief panic before settling into careful neutrality. "My mother was a governess before her marriage," he said smoothly. "She insisted on educating me beyond what my station strictly required, believing that knowledge would provide opportunities for advancement." It was plausible, and Eleanor nodded, despite lingering suspicion. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman. Her investment in your education has clearly served you well." But the incident had planted seeds of curiosity that grew over the following week as Eleanor found herself deliberately seeking out opportunities to interact with Carter, always with plausible practical justifications, but increasingly driven by simple interest in who he actually was, beneath the careful performance of assistant steward. They began discussing books during their encounters in the library, discovering shared appreciation for poetry and philosophy that made conversations extend far beyond what necessity required. One afternoon, perhaps 10 days after Carter's arrival, they found themselves debating the merits of Wordsworth's pastoral poetry versus Byron's emotional intensity. Eleanor had just argued that Byron's willingness to examine darkness made his work more honest than Wordsworth's retreat into nature's comforting simplicities, when Carter responded with an observation so perceptive it stopped her mid-thought. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "we're drawn to poetry that reflects our own experience. Those who've known loss and betrayal find Byron's darkness authentic, while those who've maintained optimism despite difficulty prefer Wordsworth's insistence that beauty persists even in challenging circumstances. Neither perspective is more valid. They're simply different responses to the fundamental question of how we maintain hope when life proves difficult." Eleanor looked at him sharply. "That's quite philosophical for an estate accounting discussion. You speak as though from personal experience with loss." Carter was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice held genuine emotion. "I lost someone very dear to me 7 years ago. My wife died from consumption after months of illness, and I was powerless to save her despite having—" He stopped, seeming to catch himself. "Despite doing everything possible to secure proper medical care. Watching her suffer taught me something about the limits of control and the ways that responsibility sometimes becomes a burden when you fail to protect people who depend on you." Eleanor felt tears threatening, despite her habitual guard against emotional displays. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "That must have been devastating. My mother lost 3 children before I was born. Pregnancies that ended in stillbirth or infants who lived only days. She never spoke of it. But I know the losses marked her, made her fearful about investing too much emotion in anything that might be taken without warning." They sat in silence for several minutes, the shared vulnerability creating intimacy that felt both dangerous and oddly comforting. Finally, Carter spoke again, his voice gentle. "Is that why you agreed to marry the Duke? Because you've learned to expect loss rather than hoping for happiness, and a practical arrangement feels safer than risking attachment?" The question was too perceptive, cutting too close to truths Eleanor rarely acknowledged, even to herself. "I agreed because my family's survival requires it," she said, her tone cooling as she retreated behind defensive walls. "My personal feelings are irrelevant when weighed against preventing our creditors from seizing everything." "But surely you must feel something about binding yourself for life to a man you've never met," Carter pressed. "Fear, perhaps, or resentment, or maybe hope that he'll prove less awful than you're expecting." "Hope is a luxury I cannot afford, Mr. Carter." Eleanor's voice was flat. "I learned that lesson 2 years ago." "What happened 2 years ago?" Carter asked gently, and Eleanor found herself answering despite her usual reluctance to discuss it. "I was courted by Lord Philip Blackwood. He proposed. I accepted with genuine joy. Then I overheard him at a house party, laughing with his friends about how tedious courting me had been, but necessary to secure my father's business connections for a shipping investment. Once the investment was secured, he planned to end our engagement and pursue women who possessed the beauty and youth I apparently lack." She met Carter's eyes directly. "I ended things first, but the damage was done. I'd trusted my judgment about his character, and my judgment proved catastrophically wrong. So now I don't trust. Not my instincts about people, not men's declarations, not anything beyond concrete evidence and practical arrangements with clear terms both parties understand they're expected to fulfill." Carter looked at her with an expression that combined sympathy and something else Eleanor couldn't quite identify. "Not all men are fortune-hunting manipulators," he said quietly. "Some people do actually mean what they say." "Perhaps," Eleanor agreed, rising to signal the conversation was concluded. "But how does one distinguish between authentic feeling and skillful performance when both look identical from the outside?" "I'd rather assume all men are performing and be pleasantly surprised on rare occasions when one proves genuine, than risk trusting again only to discover I've been deceived by someone whose acting skills exceeded Lord Blackwood's considerable talents." The conversation haunted Eleanor throughout the following week, as did her growing awareness that James Carter's presence had begun to matter to her in ways that felt dangerous, given her determination to maintain emotional distance. She caught herself looking for him during her daily routines, felt genuine pleasure when they encountered each other in the library or the estate office, found his observations and questions occupying her thoughts even when they were apart. 2 weeks after Carter's arrival, they had their most revealing conversation yet. It was late afternoon, and Eleanor had been reviewing correspondence when Carter appeared in the library doorway. "Forgive the interruption, my lady, but I wondered if you might have time to discuss the tenant situation in the northern fields. I've been reviewing the agreements, and I think there may be more equitable arrangements we could negotiate that would benefit both the estate and the families working the land." Eleanor gestured for him to sit, and for the next hour they discussed agricultural policy and tenant welfare, with the kind of engaged intellectual partnership Eleanor had never expected to find, certainly not with someone supposedly in Carter's position. He listened when she offered opinions, built on her observations rather than dismissing them, treated her as an equal in the discussion, rather than as a lady whose ideas needed to be politely tolerated but ultimately ignored. "You're remarkable," Carter said suddenly, setting aside the papers they'd been reviewing. "The way you think about these issues, considering both practical economics and human welfare, refusing to accept that efficiency must come at the cost of compassion. The Duke of Greystone is extraordinarily fortunate in his choice of bride." "You seem quite confident in your assessment of His Grace's perspective," Eleanor observed, something in Carter's phrasing triggering unease. "For an assistant steward, you speak with unusual authority about ducal opinions." Carter's expression shifted, something like pain or guilt crossing his features. "Eleanor," he began, then stopped, seeming to reconsider. "Lady Eleanor, forgive me. That was presumptuous." But the moment had passed, and shortly after Carter excused himself, leaving Eleanor with the unsettling sense that there was far more to James Carter than his performed role suggested. 3 weeks after Carter's arrival at Ashworth Hall, Eleanor's father summoned her to his study with an expression that combined satisfaction and nervous energy. "The Duke of Greystone will be arriving tomorrow," Lord Ashworth declared. "His Grace has written to confirm he's satisfied with Mr. Carter's reports and is prepared to proceed with finalising the marriage arrangements. The wedding will take place in 3 weeks." Eleanor felt something cold settling in her stomach, but she nodded with calm acceptance. "I'll ensure I'm appropriately prepared to meet His Grace. Has Mr. Carter completed his work here?" "Carter is leaving this evening," her father replied. "The Duke requested his return to Greystone Manor before his own arrival. Something about needing Carter to prepare reports. You should probably thank him for his assistance before he departs." Eleanor found James Carter in the library an hour before his scheduled departure, and she was surprised by the intensity of her reluctance about his leaving. "Mr. Carter," she said from the doorway, "I understand you're departing this evening. I wanted to thank you for your assistance and for the conversations we've shared. They've been unexpectedly valuable in ways that extended beyond practical estate matters." Carter set down the papers he'd been reviewing and stood with an expression that held barely concealed emotion. "The value has been entirely mutual, Lady Eleanor. These weeks at Ashworth Hall have been illuminating in ways I didn't anticipate. You are remarkable, intelligent, resilient, far more compassionate than you allow most people to see beneath your defensive reserve. The Duke of Greystone is extraordinarily fortunate, though I suspect he doesn't yet fully comprehend exactly how fortunate he is." "You speak with unusual confidence about His Grace's perspective," Eleanor said, that same unease from their previous conversation returning stronger now. Carter reached into his pocket and withdrew a heavy gold signet ring bearing a ducal crest Eleanor recognized from correspondence about the marriage arrangements. He slid it onto his finger with practiced ease. "My name is William Hartwell," he said quietly, meeting her eyes. "I am the Duke of Greystone. I came here in disguise because I wanted to observe your character before binding myself to a marriage with someone I'd never met. Wanted to see whether you were kind to servants and whether you possessed genuine depth beneath your social performance. I know my methods were deceptive and probably unforgivable, but everything I learned about you was real. Your intelligence, your resilience, your capacity for compassion, despite your cynicism." Eleanor felt the world tilting, comprehension crashing over her in waves. "You lied," she said, her voice shaking. "You deliberately deceived me. Let me believe you were someone else while you gathered information and made assessments. You're no different from Philip, from every other man who has pretended interest in me while actually viewing me as a means to achieve objectives." "That's not true," William protested. "Yes, I deceived you about my identity, and yes, I came here intending to observe you clinically. But Eleanor, what happened between us was real. The conversations, the connection, the moments of genuine emotional honesty. I fell in love with you during these weeks." "Your feelings," Eleanor repeated, her tone scathing. "You'll forgive me if I find your declarations difficult to credit, given that you've spent 3 weeks systematically lying while manipulating me into revealing private thoughts I would never have shared with the Duke of Greystone. You wanted to assess whether I was suitable. Well, Your Grace, let me save you the trouble. I am not suitable. I am cynical and defensive, and apparently completely incapable of distinguishing between authentic feeling and skillful manipulation, since I actually began to care about James Carter." "I'm sorry," William said, raw emotion in his voice. "You're absolutely right that my methods were wrong, that I violated your trust in ways that probably can't be repaired. But Eleanor, please understand. I've been alone for 7 years since my wife died, convinced I would never feel anything beyond hollow performance for whoever I eventually married out of duty. Coming here and discovering you, discovering that connection was still possible, that was hope I hadn't expected to find." He moved closer, though he stopped when she stepped back. "I'm asking, possibly with no right to ask, whether you might be willing to proceed with the marriage despite my deception. Not because financial necessity compels you, but because what we found during these weeks might be worth building on, even though the foundation is deeply flawed." Eleanor wanted to refuse, to throw his proposal back in his face, but her father's debts remained. The creditors would seize everything, and refusing would accomplish nothing beyond satisfying her immediate need for vindictive rejection while forcing her back into an impossible situation. "I'll proceed with the marriage," she said finally, each word emerging with effort. "Because my family's survival requires it, and because I'm not brave enough to choose poverty over binding myself to someone who has demonstrated he's willing to lie when he believes circumstances justify deception. But understand this, Your Grace. Our marriage will be exactly the business transaction I originally expected. You'll have your heir and your household management. I'll have financial security. But there will be no intimacy beyond what biology requires, no friendship beyond what courtesy demands in public, and absolutely no possibility that I will ever trust you enough to share genuine thoughts or feelings." "I understand," William said quietly, "and I accept those terms, even though I'll spend however long it takes trying to earn back the trust I destroyed." He moved to the window, his posture revealing vulnerability. "When my wife died, I was devastated, not just by loss, but by guilt about having married for duty rather than love. Elizabeth and I were fond of each other, but our marriage was arranged and we never quite managed to transform practical partnership into genuine intimacy before illness took her. I spent 7 years alone because I couldn't face binding myself to another woman out of pure obligation. But I needed an heir, needed to prevent my reckless nephew from inheriting estates he would destroy." He turned back to Eleanor. "Then I learned about your situation, and something made me want to meet you before making commitments. So I came as James Carter to see whether you were kind or cruel, genuine or false, worth risking emotional investment, or simply another aristocrat who viewed servants as furniture. And I found you, Eleanor. I found someone intelligent and wounded and strong, someone who deserved better than being forced into marriage with a duke who viewed her as a convenient solution to inheritance problems." "That's a lovely story, Your Grace," Eleanor said coldly, "but it doesn't change the fact that you deceived me, used my confidence by letting me believe I was speaking to someone without power to judge. You've assessed my character. I hope I met your standards, because you're getting exactly what you evaluated. Someone practical enough to honor commitments even when circumstances make them painful. Someone cynical enough to accept that marriage is a transaction. Someone strong enough to maintain dignity while performing a role I never wanted." The wedding took place 3 weeks later in Ashworth Hall's small chapel, a ceremony that maintained all traditional formalities while feeling hollow at its emotional core. Eleanor wore her mother's wedding dress and spoke her vows with a clear voice that revealed none of the complicated emotions beneath her composed exterior. William responded with equal clarity, his hand warm when he placed the ring on her finger, his kiss brief and formal when the ceremony concluded. It was the evening before the wedding that William made his last attempt at bridging the chasm his deception had created. He requested Eleanor meet him in the library, and when she arrived, she found him standing with a small silver key resting on his palm. "This is the key to my late wife's private garden pavilion at Greystone Manor," he said without preamble. "No one has entered that space since Elizabeth died 7 years ago. It contains her books, her journals, her painting supplies, everything that mattered to her personally. I go there sometimes, when the grief becomes overwhelming, when I need to remember what I lost and why I've been so afraid of risking genuine connection again." He offered her the key. "I'm giving you this as a symbol of my commitment to complete honesty going forward, Eleanor. You can enter that pavilion whenever you choose, read Elizabeth's private thoughts, understand exactly what our marriage was, and why her death marked me so deeply. I won't hide my past or my pain from you, won't present some edited version that makes me appear more admirable than reality justifies." Eleanor took the key with trembling fingers. "Why would you give me access to something so private?" "Because I want you to know me," William replied simply. "The real me, not the performance I maintained as James Carter or the ducal facade I present to society. Elizabeth's pavilion contains the truth about who I was and who I became after her death. I'm trusting you with that truth because trust is the only foundation worth building on, even if the initial construction was deeply flawed by my deception." Eleanor placed the key in her reticule without promising she would use it, and William accepted this with visible disappointment, but no protest. The first 3 months of their marriage settled into a pattern that was functional, if not warm. William treated Eleanor with unfailing courtesy and respect, included her in estate decisions, never pressured her for physical intimacy beyond what their minimal public appearances required, gave her complete authority over household management and charitable initiatives. Eleanor fulfilled her obligations with equal correctness, managing Greystone Manor with impressive efficiency, attending social functions with appropriate Duchess performance, maintaining polite conversation during shared meals without venturing into personal territory. But beneath her maintained anger, Eleanor found herself increasingly aware of William's patient consistency. One evening, perhaps 6 weeks into their marriage, she came upon him in the estate office late at night, reviewing tenant petitions. He looked up when she entered. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disturb you," Eleanor said. "You're not disturbing me." William set aside the papers. "I was just reviewing these requests for rent reductions. The harvest was poor in the northern fields, and several families are struggling. I wanted to ensure we respond fairly." Eleanor moved closer to examine the petitions. "You're being remarkably generous," she observed, noting the substantial reductions he was proposing. "It's the right thing to do," William replied. "These are good people facing circumstances beyond their control." Showing compassion now builds loyalty that benefits the estate long-term, but more importantly, it's simply what decency requires when you have resources others lack. It was a small moment, but it stayed with Eleanor. Evidence that William's values aligned with what he demonstrated as James Carter, that his concern for people's welfare wasn't performance, but genuine principle. Another evening, perhaps 2 months into their marriage, Eleanor encountered William in the library. He was reading, and he looked up with a smile that faded when he saw her expression. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "I should have asked if you wanted to use the library this evening. I'll leave—" "Don't be ridiculous," Eleanor interrupted. "This is your library, Your Grace." "It's your library too," William corrected gently. "And I prefer William when we're alone, if you're comfortable with that informality." Eleanor settled into a chair with her own book, and they read in companionable silence for perhaps an hour. Finally, William spoke. "I've been thinking about what you said during one of our conversations at Ashworth Hall, about your mother and her fear of loss. Does that fear affect your willingness to consider having children? Because, Eleanor, I need you to know that if childbirth frightens you, after knowing your mother's history, I would never pressure you to risk your life simply to provide heirs. Your safety matters more than succession." The unexpected consideration made Eleanor's throat tighten. "I appreciate that," she said quietly, "though I accepted when I married you that providing heirs would be part of our arrangement." "Our arrangement can be modified if circumstances warrant," William replied. "You're not obligated to risk your health or your life to fulfill terms you agreed to under duress." These moments accumulated over the 3 months, small demonstrations of William's character that gradually eroded Eleanor's certainty that his feelings were manufactured rather than genuine, that the connection they'd built at Ashworth Hall had been entirely his calculated manipulation, rather than authentic bond that had developed despite the deceptive circumstances of its origin. And the silver key remained in her jewelry box, untouched but not forgotten, its presence a constant reminder of William's offer to let her see the truth of his past without filters. It was exactly 3 months after their wedding when Eleanor finally made the decision to use the key. She had been walking in Greystone's extensive gardens when she noticed the small pavilion set apart from the main grounds, its windows shuttered and its door clearly unused for years based on the overgrown path. Eleanor found herself drawn toward it with the key retrieved from her jewelry box and clutched in her hand. She unlocked the door with trembling fingers and stepped into a space that felt frozen in time. Dust covering surfaces, books arranged on shelves with personal organization, an easel holding a half-finished painting of Greystone's rose garden, journals stacked on a writing desk. She had expected to be alone, but as her eyes adjusted, she realized with shock that William was already there. He sat in a chair near the writing desk with one of Elizabeth's journals open on his lap. and his face was wet with tears he wasn't attempting to hide. He looked up when Eleanor entered, and for a moment neither spoke. "I didn't expect you to come today," he said finally, his voice rough. "I came here to—" He gestured helplessly at the journal. "I've been trying to read Elizabeth's private thoughts for 7 years, trying to understand what she felt about our marriage. I finally found the courage this morning." Eleanor moved closer despite her habitual wariness, drawn by the raw pain in his expression. "What did you learn?" William looked down at the journal. "She knew I didn't love her," he said quietly. "Knew our marriage was duty rather than desire, but she hoped that over time we might develop genuine affection, that the respect we shared might transform into something deeper. And I failed her in that hope, Eleanor. I remained dutiful and correct and fundamentally distant until illness took her before I'd gathered courage to actually let her know me." "You're being too hard on yourself," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the instinctive defense. "You were young when you married, raised with certain expectations. That you recognize now what you failed to provide suggests you've grown in ways that might make you capable of better partnership if given another opportunity." William raised his eyes to meet hers, hope and fear warring in his expression. "Is that what you're offering? Another opportunity? Because Eleanor, these 3 months of living beside you while maintaining careful distance have been torture precisely because I know what we could have if you were willing to risk trusting me again. I love you. I fell in love with you at Ashworth Hall, and that love has only deepened as I've watched you manage Greystone and navigate society and maintain your dignity despite your justified anger. But I won't pressure you into reciprocating feelings you don't share. So I'm asking whether you might be willing to try building something real rather than continuing our business transaction." Eleanor found tears gathering despite her efforts at control. "I'm tired," she admitted. "Tired of being angry. Tired of maintaining walls that feel more like prison than protection. Tired of denying that I developed real feelings for James Carter that haven't disappeared simply because James Carter turned out to be William Hartwell. I don't know if I can completely trust you yet, but I think I'm willing to try, to see whether the foundation we built might still be worth building on despite its flaws." William set aside the journal and crossed to kneel before Eleanor's chair, his hands reaching tentatively for hers. When she didn't pull away, he took her hands with gentleness that made her breath catch. "I will spend the rest of our lives earning your complete trust," he said, voice thick with him. "I'll be honest, even when honesty is difficult. I'll include you in decisions. I'll never again deceive you or use information you've shared to evaluate rather than receive with intimate regard. You have my word, Eleanor. And I recognize my word may not mean much given how thoroughly I violated your trust initially, but I'm asking you to let me prove through consistent action that I'm capable of being the partner you deserve." Eleanor leaned forward and kissed him, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as William responded with restrained passion that communicated desire tempered by respect for her autonomy. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Eleanor felt something settling in her chest that might have been the beginning of trust cautiously extended. "I love you," she whispered against his mouth. "I think I fell in love with James Carter at Ashworth Hall, and I've been trying to convince myself those feelings were invalid because they were based on deception. But maybe feelings can be real even when circumstances are complicated. Maybe connections can be genuine even when they begin with flawed foundations. I'm willing to try building something together, William. Not the business transaction I insisted our marriage would remain, but actual partnership based on vulnerability and honesty." They spent the rest of the afternoon in Elizabeth's pavilion, William reading passages from her journals that revealed a woman who had been kind and thoughtful and deeply lonely, Eleanor sharing her own journals from the period after Philip's betrayal, and gradually, through mutual vulnerability and shared honesty about their respective wounds, they began building something that felt like authentic partnership. Elizabeth wrote near the end, William said as afternoon light began fading, that some foundations, despite their flaws, are worth building upon if both parties are willing to do the work. I think she would have liked you, Eleanor, would have appreciated your strength and your refusal to accept easy comfort. I think I would have liked her too, Eleanor replied, taking William's hand. And I think she was right about foundations. Ours was deeply flawed, but maybe we can build something worthwhile on it if we're both committed to honesty and vulnerability going forward. They walked back to Greystone Manor, together with their hands linked and their future no longer feeling like an obligation to be endured, but rather like the possibility to be actively created through choice and effort, and authentic partnership that required constant work, but promised rewards that transcended what either had expected. The silver key remained in Eleanor's possession, not hidden anymore but worn on a chain around her neck, as reminder of the moment when she'd chosen to risk trusting again, when William had chosen vulnerability over performed strength, when they'd both decided that foundations could be repaired if both parties were willing to do the difficult work of honest building. And years later, when people asked Eleanor about her marriage to the Duke of Greystone, she would smile and say simply that all relationships begin with some element of performance and discovery, that the question isn't whether initial impressions prove accurate, but whether both parties are willing to move beyond performance into authentic connection. He deceived me at the beginning, she would admit, but he's been honest every day since. And that consistent honesty has built trust that's stronger than what we might have had if we'd started from conventional courtship, because we both know exactly how badly things can go wrong when people hide their true selves. And we're both committed to never making that mistake again. Oh, the silver key became a private symbol between them. James, a term of endearment Eleanor used when William was being particularly thoughtful. My steward, her gentle teasing when he became too focused on estate matters. Reminders that their relationship had been forged through unconventional circumstances, but had become genuine through persistent effort and mutual commitment to building something worth the initial pain of discovery and reconciliation.